Hey everybody, in this lesson I want to have a chat to you about development. Now if you're already an experienced developer and you've been building solutions for a long time, you can absolutely feel free to skip this lesson. For everyone else, what I want to have a chat to you about are what sort of things do we need to do when we actually develop solutions? What does the workflow look like in terms of writing code and getting it onto some sort of application server or web server? And to understand that, we're going to walk through a really basic scenario. Now, why might you want to know about development? Maybe you're not a developer, but perhaps you want to move into the DevOps field. Or perhaps you're actually an Azure infrastructure administrator and you just want to appreciate the underlying things that developers need to have working for them when they go and build and deploy their solutions. So this is just going to be a really high-level walkthrough of some key components, key outputs, and help you to get an understanding of what that development workflow looks like. So let's go ahead and take a look. Let's say you are a developer and you want to build some sort of application, maybe a web application like the fictitious Aussie Mart web store. You want to have that application accessible to your users. So we know these are some of the key components, right? The developer that builds the solution, the users that access them, and the app itself. And really importantly, that's of course going to sit on some sort of application infrastructure somewhere. If this is a web application, it might be sitting on a Linux or Windows web server, or maybe something like Azure App Service. If it's some sort of enterprise application, maybe you have a range of different components like application servers, database servers, and various other things. Those are all very important components, but what I want to focus on within this lesson is more about how does the developer develop that application and how do they go and build and deploy it to get it available to their users. So let's just take a look at those high-level steps right now. First things first, as a developer, you are of course going to develop the solution. Now what I'm talking about here is where you're going to use some sort of programming language, maybe something like Java, PHP, or whatever language actually suits your purposes. You are going to use that language to go and write some code that's going to make this solution that you want to make available to your end users or serve some sort of purpose. Now this part might be more obvious, okay? We develop that solution, we write some code, but how do we actually get that available? How do we go and get that thing actually doing what we want it to do? Well, what we have to do next is something referred to as build. Commonly, when you are creating applications, you're not just going to write the code and then move that code somewhere. More often than not, that code is written in a language that is easy for humans to understand, but is not actually yet ready for the computer to be able to process and use that. So what we have to do as developers is we complete this build step. This is where we take the code, we compile it, and we turn that code into something that is in some sort of format that the application environment can execute and actually run. Okay, once we've got that application built, maybe into an executable or some other sort of package, we can go ahead and deploy it. So we go and install that on a server, maybe move it into a special folder if it's a web application, things of that nature. So these are the three main components of the developer workflow. So let's just go ahead and dive a little bit deeper into each. First things first, when we are developing the application, what you're going to do is have some sort of environment where you write that code. Typically, we'll use an application referred to as an integrated development environment, or IDE, something like Visual Studio Enterprise, Visual Studio Code, Eclipse, Xcode, WebStorm, or any one of the other hundreds of IDEs that are available out there that support the application programming language you want to use. Now, of course, if you wanted to, you could actually choose to just use a very simple text editor, but more often than not, IDEs are going to include a range of different features that help to make it much more easy to actually create the code and build an application. Whatever tool you are using to write that code, you have to store that somewhere, and there's a range of different files that we might be storing depending on the application programming language that we are using. But generally speaking, what we're talking about here is the application source code. So if you were talking about a .NET web application, for example, you might have a range of files for each of the pages within your web application. You might have the main application that's going to go ahead and tie everything together and actually execute that web app. And it's also very common that when you are building some sort of solution, you'll have a range of other files as well. Typically, you might have things like libraries, packages, modules, whatever you want to call it, depending on the language that you are using. It's really common to use these things like libraries rather than going and reinventing the wheel, you might go and get access to a range of different pre-built libraries that serve some purpose for you. Make it easy to work with a web server, work with strings, work with an operating system, and much, much more. And you might have some other application assets, things like static images or some configuration files that you actually need for your solution. Now, as a developer, the solution files are one of the pieces of the puzzle, but there is something else we should be aware of, a thing called a software development kit, or SDK for short. Now, the SDK is what's going to go and actually help you take those application source code files and do something with them. Compile them so you can go and actually deploy them somewhere, or maybe just execute it in your development environment, or perhaps perform some testing and debugging. Okay, so depending on the language that you are working with, depending on the thing that you want to build your application for, you'll be using SDKs to help support you to do that. So for example, if I'm building a .NET application that is going to work with Azure Storage, then I'll have a .NET SDK, and I can also download the Azure Storage SDK for .NET that's going to help make it easy for me to build that application to work with storage. Now, whilst it's not something we're going to talk about within this lesson, it is worth just really quickly calling out that what you see here on the screen is actually one of the reasons why it is common to see the use of containers. Because when you think about what we're talking about right now, building an application, installing all of these different bits and pieces that we need for that application on a developer's PC, okay, you can understand how we might have problems. Because what happens if we go to deploy that solution somewhere and we've forgotten to include one of those bits and pieces that is actually already installed and configured and working on the developer PC? With containers, we put that all in a nice box together so you can pick it up and put it wherever you like, and it includes everything that you need for your solution. But that's outside the scope of this lesson, and I digress. So let's move on to the next step in the process of developing a solution. And that's actually going ahead and building the application so that we can use it somewhere. So we've developed our solution, we've stored all of that in our source code, we might have some libraries, and we've used a software development kit. With that software development kit, we can actually go ahead and perform the build of the application. So if you're using something like .NET, you might actually use the .NET CLI and enter in the command .NET build and .NET publish. Now, the exact command isn't important here, and it's going to differ on how you do this depending on the language and SDK that you are using. But the principle is we've taken those source code and related files, we've used some sort of application tool, and we are going to compile our application into a range of files that can then be used for some sort of application hosting. So if this is a desktop application, you're probably going to compile your solution in such a way that it includes an installer that people can take and go and run on their computer, whether that's Windows with an exe or maybe Mac with a package file or something along those lines. What we are talking about here is taking the source code and converting it into a format that can actually be used by some sort of application server or some sort of client. Now, I find that for people who are brand new to working as a developer, this is one of the steps that is often less clear. You can sometimes think that you just build your solution, write the code, and you push all of that code somewhere and that's it. Well, in most scenarios, that's not the case, unless you are using something simple like a static HTML website. In most scenarios, you're actually going to take that source code, compile it, and turn it into this new executable format that can be used wherever you require it. So let's actually have a chat about that deployment step right now. Let's say that you've got all of your solution code, you've gone ahead and you've compiled it, and it's ready to go in that executable format for whatever you are building. Let's say we're building a website. You've compiled your web application, you've maybe got some application infrastructure ready to go. If it's a website, you might have your web server functionality installed. Let's say you're using a Windows server, and that could be IIS. You might also go ahead and install the .NET framework if this is a .NET application that you are building. The key point here is that when we go and take that compiled solution, it needs to have somewhere that it can be housed, that it can be executed. And depending on the solution that you're building and depending on the language and the features that you have used, your actual application infrastructure might need a range of things to perform the execution itself. So let's say, however, you're using this sort of approach. You've got a .NET web application, you've got your web server ready to go, you've installed all of the different components. What we now need to do is actually take that compiled solution and deploy it to the server. Now again, it's going to depend on what language you're using and what you're building in terms of where you move this to. But for a web application like we've spoken about so far, you're going to move that to something like the www root folder, and that application infrastructure is going to be able to execute that code for you so that your application is up and online and accessible to your users. So everybody, that's been a really high-level overview of something that can be quite a complex process, but I do hope that you've now got a basic understanding of the important steps that someone would follow when developing, building, and deploying a solution. Thanks for joining me, folks. That's a wrap.